Welcome to What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. This week, I'm talking to Dr. Rob Lustig about whether it's really possible to become addicted to food. And if it is, does that change how we view those who struggle in their relationship with food? This is the first podcast of 3 that I'm doing in conjunction with the International Food Addiction Consensus Conference being held in London on the 17th of May. Each will feature a different speaker from the conference. In his conference presentation, Rob argues that food addiction is a misnomer and that the issue is actually food additive addiction. He says all the medical evidence suggests that 2 additives drive this: sugar and caffeine. And while foodstuffs such as fat and salt may make our food more palatable or enticing, they are not in themselves addictive. In a staggering figure, Rob reveals of the 600,000 foods in the American food supply, 74% of them contain sugar, and over half of all sugar in the US diet is found in processed foods. But before we get to Rob's interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. Now back to the interview with Rob. Dr. Rob Lustig is Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics at the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's written a number of best-selling books about the dangers of sugar, refined carbohydrates, and metabolic illness, and his research and clinical practice have focused on childhood obesity and diabetes. He caused much controversy when he first suggested that sugar was a chronic toxin. Here's Rob's interview. Hi, Rob. Many thanks for joining the podcast today. Good to see you.
You too, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Rob, I think a lot of people, when they hear the phrase food addiction, they'll think you can't be addicted to food in the way you can, for example, to drugs or alcohol.
Well, that's a common statement. I've heard that many times from, shall we say, the other side. Food is necessary. Addictions are not. Food is survival. Addictions are not. Food is inherent in biological functioning. Addictions are not. I've heard all of these things. And that sort of makes sense at a certain level. There's no question that nicotine is not necessary for life. Cocaine is not necessary for life. For that matter, caffeine is not necessary for life. Although if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you. And alcohol is not necessary for life. Okay, there is no biochemical reaction in the body that requires any one of those 4 things. Oh, let's add heroin to the group while we're at it.
And various other drugs, doubtless. But yeah.
Right. There's no biochemical reaction that requires any one of those 5 things. That is true. Whereas we need food, there are biochemical reactions that need food. Obviously, protein synthesis, membrane synthesis. So there is this argument that how can food be addictive when food is necessary for survival? This is a straw man. This is a false argument. Let's take that apart. It is true that you need protein and fat. You need essential amino acids. You need essential fatty acids. You need minerals. You need vitamins. And you need water. You need those 5 things, or there's no life on Earth.
Sure.
Those 5 things are immutable. What about carbohydrate? Is carbohydrate necessary? Is carbohydrate required? Glucose is required. No argument. Glucose is required. But is dietary glucose required? Do you have to eat it? And the answer is no. Glucose is so important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. There are numerous demographic groups around the world that never had a carbohydrate. The Inuit, the Rendili, the Tokelau, the Maasai, they didn't have any place to grow a carbohydrate. You know, the Inuit, they had ice. They had whale blubber. They still had a serum glucose level. And the reason is because glucose is so important that amino acids can be converted to glucose in the liver. Lipids can be lipolyzed, and then the glycerol can be turned into glucose in the liver. There's a process called gluconeogenesis. So even though glucose is required, it's not necessary to consume in your diet. So just because something is available and is a food substance doesn't necessarily make it necessary. So that's counter number one on this issue. Now, counter number two, if something provides calories, is it food?
I think most people would say yes, wouldn't they?
Well, they would say yes, and they would be wrong.
Thought you might say that.
And they would be wrong twice over.
Yeah.
And the reason they would be wrong is twofold. Number one, alcohol, and number two, trans fats. Trans fats and alcohol both have calories. Trans fats have 9 calories per gram. Alcohol has 7 calories per gram. Neither of those are food. Just because they have calories doesn't make them food. In fact, both of those are poisons and have been labeled as such by the FDA, despite the fact that they have a caloric equivalent. Trans fats will kill you. Alcohol will kill you. There's no biochemical reaction in the body that requires trans fats. There's no biochemical reaction in the body that can break down trans fats. Now, alcohol, there is a biochemical reaction that can break it down, but when it breaks down to a toxin called acetaldehyde, which damages cells. And there's no question that alcohol is addictive. It is both toxic and addictive, despite the fact that it has 7 calories per gram. So just because something has calories doesn't make it a food. There's no dietitian on the planet who will tell you that alcohol is food.
Sure.
So now let's turn to sugar, because that's the big issue here. Is sugar a food? Is ultra-processed food a food?
Well, I guess some people survive almost exclusively on ultra-processed food. So if it wasn't a food, they wouldn't be able to do so.
Well, yes, no. They can survive on the calories, but the fact of the matter is it is toxic and addictive also. So what is the definition of food? And this will come up at our food addiction consensus conference multiple times. What is the definition of food? Because how can you be addicted to something when you don't know what it is? So what is the definition of food? Well, the answer is, and you go to the dictionary, this is the dictionary definition of food: substrate that contributes to either growth or burning of an organism. That is a 100% identifiable, verifiable, and complete definition. I love that definition. That is exactly right. Does sugar contribute to growth? In fact, sugar inhibits growth. My colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsonigo Ornan at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, has shown that sugar and, in addition, ultra-processed food actually inhibits growth. It inhibits cortical bone growth, trabecular bone growth, statural bone growth. It actually hijacks growth in terms of cancer formation. What about burning? Now, you would say, well, sugar has 4 calories per gram. It burns. But in fact, fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, the one that is addictive, the molecule we seek, the molecule that is metabolized differently from that of glucose.
And table sugar is a 50% fructose.
That's right. But that fructose molecule actually inhibits mitochondrial function. It inhibits 3 separate enzymes involved in mitochondrial function. It inhibits AMP kinase, the enzyme that's the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is necessary to take fats and cleave it into 2 carbon fragments so that they can be burned. And finally, it inhibits CPT1, carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, which is the shuttle mechanism for getting fats into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. Bottom line, we have the data to demonstrate that, in fact, fructose inhibits burning.
And just to be clear, Rob, you're less concerned about the fructose in whole fruit.
It's the same molecule. It's the same molecule. The difference in fruit is that the fructose in the fruit never got into your bloodstream.
Because the fiber in the fruit slows down the process.
That's right. The fiber in the fruit actually kept the fructose in the intestinal lumen so that the bacteria, the microbiome, utilized it for its purposes. So, yes, it was sweet. Yes, it touched your taste buds. Yes, you liked it. But in fact, it never got into your circulation to do the damage. So the fructose in fruit is the same molecule, but it doesn't have the same directive. And the reason is because it never got absorbed. Now, as soon as you take the fiber away, and we call that fruit juice, now it all gets absorbed and it does exactly the same thing as purified sugar from any candy, cake, ice cream, or soft drink. So the only thing that's standing in the way of fruit being toxic is the fiber in the fruit. So eat the fruit, don't drink the juice, is what I say. The people on the other side will argue till the cows come home. Well, what about fruit? And the answer is the reason for the fruit is the fiber.
Several times you've referred to the people on the other side.
Yes, there are the naysayers.
So would you quantify what counts as the people on the other side?
There's almost a geographic divide on this. The American scientists are pretty much on board with the idea that fructose is addictive. The Europeans don't seem to be. And there is a group, they are called neurofast, neurofast.eu. And they are led by a scientist, a PhD out of Germany by the name of Johannes Heberbrand. And there are several other people who are in this group called Neurofast. And they argue that, in fact, it is not food addiction, it is eating addiction. And they have put out several papers to that effect. And there have been multiple debates in the medical literature, the most recent one occurring in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition between Ashley Gearhart on the American addictive side and Johannes Heberbrand on the non-addictive European side, and multiple other ones. And we have Nicole Avena at Princeton University versus Paul Fletcher at Cambridge. And so there does seem to be this continental divide between the adherents to the concept of food addiction and the naysayers. And, the question is, who's right? I will be presenting at the International Food Addiction Consensus Conference on May 17th in London on the battle, the basic precepts that each side uses, and I will try to take it apart. And ultimately, what I will say is that it is not food addiction. I agree. It is not food addiction. It is food additive addiction. It is the additives that are added to food that are the problem, not the food itself. So the question is sugar a food? And I've already explained to you, sugar is not a food because it does not meet the criteria for food. Well, that makes it a food additive. And we call it that, added sugar. And we're not talking about the sugar that's inherent in an orange, but take the fiber out, now it's something different. It's been purified in the same way that coca leaves were medicinal, but cocaine is a drug, in the same way that alcohol is actually a preservative, but in high dose alcohol is a drug. When you purify it, when you concentrate it, you change its properties. I would argue that the same thing has happened to sugar. Sugar always comes with its inherent fiber, like sugar cane. Okay, it's a stick. You can't even chew the damn thing. But as soon as you turn it into the crystals, as soon as you purify it, it now takes on new properties. And that is not a food, that is a food additive.
Is there a difference between dependence and addiction, though?
Well, there's a slight difference. Dependence is a psychological term. Addiction's a biochemical term. So they're not quite the same. The difference is addiction has two components. Tolerance, which means more and more for less and less. And the reason for that is downregulation of the dopamine D2 receptor. So dopamine downregulates its own receptor. So the more you consume, the less effect it has on you. So therefore, the more you need to consume to get the effect, and therefore the less effect it has on you. And so that's the vicious cycle of consumption. It's called tolerance, the law of diminishing returns. So that's part one. And the second part is either, and this is where things get complicated, withdrawal or dependence. So let's take that apart. Withdrawal and dependence. And we will discuss this at the May 17th meeting. Prior to 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-4, which was composed in 1993, it said that you had to have tolerance and withdrawal to be addictive. But in the intervening 20 years after that, what happened was that we learned that gambling was addictive. And gambling met all the criteria for addiction, and that there was rehab for gambling.
And just to be clear, the DSM-4 manual was designed for psychiatric conditions.
That's right. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Conditions. And the fact is that gambling could be modulated and treated in the same way as other addictive substances. But gambling's not a substance. Gambling's a behavior. So gambling did not have withdrawal, like gambling had dependence. And the reason is because when you look at the phenomena of withdrawal for each of the different toxic substances, those are all peripheral effects. Gambling doesn't have any peripheral effects because there's no chemical. So yes, cocaine had effects on the eyes and on the GI tract. Heroin had effects on the GI tract and on the heart. Caffeine had effects, on piloerection and mydriasis of the eyes, etc. You could quantitate the effects on the body. So when withdrawal occurred, you could demonstrate that because there was a biomarker peripherally that you could see. But for behavioral addictions like gambling, you couldn't see those. There was no method for being able to quantitate them. So in order to be able to get rehab services for gambling, the DSM, they had to change the definition of addiction. And what they did was they said, okay, tolerance, yes, that's right. But you can have either withdrawal for chemicals or dependence. And that worked for behaviors. And that's how they got gambling in under the wire. And that's why you can now get rehab services and insurance will pay for gambling treatment. Well, it turns out the same is true for pornography and internet gaming and social media and shopping, the same issues. Those are all addictive behaviors. They still generate dopamine in the same way. They still downregulate the dopamine D2 receptor. They just don't have a biomarker of withdrawal. But they're still addictive, and we agree that they're addictive. So the definition of addiction changed in 2013 with the DSM-5. So now it's either tolerance plus withdrawal or tolerance plus dependence. So dependence is part of addiction. And sugar meets that completely. Tolerance and dependence. And we have the data in terms of what it takes to call something dependent. So that's how sugar is addictive, tolerance and dependence.
And this is important because if there are no food additives, which it can be argued are addictive, then you can argue that's the individual's responsibility.
Exactly.
But if there are food additives which have addictive qualities, then there might be an argument that the food industry has a greater responsibility.
And this is exactly why this consensus conference is important, is for just that reason. If NeuroFast is right and it's eating addiction, then the onus is on the individual, in which case nothing will ever get done. If, on the other hand, there is a thing called food addiction, and I don't actually believe in food addiction, I believe in food additive addiction, as I've said. And if you then say, okay, there's this thing called food additive addiction, then what we need to do is we need to regulate those, irrespective of food. But when we regulate those, it will, of course, change food anyway. And that's where I think we need to go.
So what biological evidence is there for the impact that certain foodstuffs or additives have on our bodies?
And so that's where the neuroimaging comes in. So you can stick somebody in a scanner and you can measure what's going on in different parts of the brain, as has been done by people like Eric Steiss at Oregon Health Sciences University, or Benito Wollnerhausen in Switzerland, or many other people are now doing this, where you actually can give them different foodstuffs through a straw while they're in the MRI scanner. And you can do functional MRI on different parts of the brain to determine what lights up and what doesn't. And it turns out that glucose and fructose light up different parts of the brain. Glucose lights up what basically is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is the part of the brain that is subcortical but involved in perception and motor, whereas fructose lights up the limbic system, and in particular, the nucleus accumbens, the reward center. All of the things that are addictive, and it doesn't matter if it's substances or behaviors, they all light up the nucleus accumbens. Glucose doesn't, fructose does. So there's the first clue. The second clue, aside from the neuroimaging, is the biochemical analysis of what happens to the dopamine D2 receptors. And we have that in terms of C11 raclopride in PET scanning. And we also have it by treating animals and demonstrating the downregulation, lack of expression of the dopamine D2 receptors. And that's across species. So we have the lab data, we have the imaging data, we have the demographic and the epidemiological data. We have the mechanistic data to demonstrate that, in fact, sugar, and specifically the fructose molecule, generates a reward signal that is indistinguishable from any other biochemical addictive stimulus and has the same consequences on brain function and behavior. I don't know what else more you need.
What about other foods? For example, dairy.
Yeah, so dairy is very interesting because there appear to be opioid receptors that are specific for dairy in the intestinal lining called casomorphin receptors. And we don't understand these too well yet, but they definitely seem to have some effect on the brain. They seem to have some psychoactive effect that is neurally mediated rather than blood mediated. So that these things like, for instance, in cheese, one of the reasons why cheese is so popular, will bind to these receptors and then initiate an effect through the afferent vagus nerve that will go up to the brain and lead to a feeling of reward as well. So that does seem to be the case, but that is not mediated through a blood-borne effect. All the other biochemical phenomena that lead to addiction are through a blood-borne effect rather than through a neural effect. So I'm not as concerned about the casomorphin issue.
Processed fats can also stimulate certain receptors in the brain.
Yeah, trans fats are, mitochondrial toxins, as I've talked about. Trans fats do get into the brain, but we know this, and we know that trans fats are not food, and they have been designated as not generally recognized as safe by the FDA, and they are coming out of our food not fast enough and not completely enough. I don't know if you know the story of rounding down of trans fats. So the FDA has basically said that if a food has 0.49 grams per serving of trans fats, the food industry can label it as 0. But if it's 0.50 or greater, then they have to label it as having trans fats. So 0.49 is the break point. Well, the people who have done the work on trans fats say that if you consume 2 grams of trans fat per day, you're going to die.
Well, can you break that down for me, Rob, in terms of you're going to die? What they mean is presumably it'll have a detrimental effect over a number of years.
That's right. It will have cardiovascular complications, diabetes complications, metabolic syndrome complications, because trans fats are a mitochondrial poison, because they can't be broken down. Trans double bond is unbreakable. And so what they do is they line your arteries, they line your pancreas, and they basically cause cellular metabolic dysfunction and lead to metabolic syndrome, and therefore cell, organ, and then finally human death. The point is that if you consume 2 grams of trans fats per day, you're on your way there. Well, if you consume 4 granola bars that say no trans fats, but are actually 0.49 grams of trans fats because of this rounding down issue, you can still kill yourself.
Do you know if the European and British food agencies use the same metric?
Yeah,
They do the same.
they do the same. This is a problem. This continues to be a problem.
And Rob, what role does the hormone leptin play in all of this?
Leptin is a hormone. It is a peptide hormone that is made by fat cells. It is made when fat gets made in the cell. It is then released from the fat cell, goes through the bloodstream, and goes to the brain, goes to other places too, but mostly the brain, to the hypothalamus, and tells the brain, hey, I have enough energy on board stored in adipose tissue so that I can burn energy at a normal rate and I can engage in expensive metabolic processes such as puberty and pregnancy. Leptin is like the thermostat in your house. It will not let you go too low. If you go too low, the heat kicks on. If your body stores of fat go too low, your leptin tells your brain, hey, kick on the food intake. It doesn't stimulate food intake directly. It gives your brain a sense of there's enough energy on board so that I can burn properly, so I don't have to engage in more food intake. So it's a negative effect, not a positive effect. It is not a stimulator of food intake, whereas its deficiency is a stimulator of food intake. So when fat goes into the fat cell, either the fat cell made it or it got it imported, either way, it will generate a leptin response. You will get more leptin, and therefore your brain will see that you are not starving. But when your leptin levels fall, your brain will interpret that as starvation. Now, here's the problem. We got a whole bunch of obese people who clearly are not starving, whose leptin levels are sky high because they have all this adipose tissue. But for whatever reason, the brain is not seeing it. Because if the brain were seeing it, then they wouldn't be obese. So clearly there is something wrong in the signal transduction of the leptin signal in the brain. What is blocking the leptin signal? We call this leptin resistance. There is a huge amount of literature dating back to around 1995 till present day of what causes leptin resistance. Because if you could figure that out, you could solve obesity. Well, there are probably a few things that cause leptin resistance, but one of them, the one that I found, the one that I worked on, the one that I contributed to back in the late 1990s through the mid 2000s, is the hormone insulin. Insulin blocks leptin signaling, period. We have the data, we have the mechanism, we have the documentation, we have the studies, and I will show some of them on May 17th at this London meeting.
And basically, as we eat more refined carbohydrates, including sugar, that pushes our insulin levels up.
That's right. And that blocks the leptin. And so when the insulin goes up, your brain can't see the leptin. And when your brain can't see the leptin, your brain thinks you're starving, which makes you eat more. And so refined carbohydrate, by generating an insulin response, generates more obesity. So this is known as the carbohydrate insulin model. And I have been a subscriber to the carbohydrate insulin model for many years. Now, having said that, there is a new model, which I am actually more interested in, and it is called the redox model. What it says is that every biochemical that enters your cell undergoes a redox reaction. That is an oxidation reduction reaction. That's what redox stands for, where basically the energy causes changes in phosphorylation status of enzymes in cells, which then cause the cell to either want to store energy or burn it. It is the switch that tells a cell, yes, store it, or no, burn it. It is this change in phosphorylation status that matters more than just carbohydrate. Protein can engage in this, lipid can engage in this. And obesogens, chemicals that don't have calories, but cause adiposity, like, for instance, PFAS, polyfluoroalkylating substances. BPA, bisphenol A, which is on receipts that you get at the grocery store. PBDEs, which are flame retardants in your clothing. Phthalates, which are plasticizers, like in binkies and rubber duckies for babies. Parabens, which are in your cosmetics and your lipstick. All of these have been shown to increase adiposity. They do so not because of calories and not because of carbohydrate, but because of changes in redox. And so it turns out the carbohydrate insulin model and the energy balance model actually all participate in this redox change. And we think this is actually the real substantive problem. And that's the thing that ties together both the food and the environment in terms of why obesity is occurring. But again, in no uncertain terms, arguing against this eating addiction concept.
Rob, you mentioned in your presentation that sometimes we don't even need to eat the food for it to affect us. I think our insulin levels can be altered just by the sight and smell of food.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a famous set of studies that were done back in the mid-'80s. It's called the cephalic phase of insulin release. Terry Powley, Indiana University, I think was the first person to demonstrate this, but it's been shown time and time and again. What you do is you take people, normal people, fat people, doesn't matter. You put them in the hospital overnight, put an IV in them the night before. They wake up in the morning, they haven't eaten anything, their insulin levels are low, their glucose levels are normal, everything's stable. And then what you do is you bring in a tray of food and you put the tray of food down and you take the top off the tray and you let the smell and the sight of the food wash over this patient for 10 minutes. And then you take the tray away.
Sounds torturous.
A little bit. The point is, no food, no liquid, no nothing has passed the lips of that patient. The glucose level of that patient has not changed because you're measuring it while this is happening. That's why you have the IV in. But when you look at the insulin response, there's a jump in insulin. Insulin is predicated on the level of obesity of the patient. So thin people only have a little insulin jump, but obese people have a much higher insulin jump. Now, where'd the insulin jump come from if there was no change in glucose? If there was no food consumed, why did the insulin rise? And the answer is because the brain sends a message to the pancreas through the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve releases acetylcholine at the level of the beta cell and causes that beta cell to function anyway. The degree of functioning is predicated on the degree of obesity. So obese people will have a bigger response, and that bigger response will cause more food craving, more food intake, more leptin antagonism, and basically drive further food consumption. In cases where you have ad lib feeding afterwards, excess food consumption. So that brain to pancreas connection is exceedingly important. And this is one of the things that I studied back in the mid-'90s in these kids with brain tumors, where they had a dysfunctional relationship between the hypothalamus and the pancreas because of overactivation of this vagus nerve, a phenomenon we called insulin hypersecretion.
I'm interested, Rob, given the role of brain chemicals in obesity, what your perspective is on the new generation of weight loss drugs.
Right. So I wear three hats. The first hat is a clinician hat. The second hat is a scientist hat. And the third hat is a public health advocate hat. And I have different responses based on which hat I'm wearing at the moment. So when I have my clinician hat on, the answer is, I'm glad these drugs are here. People need them. There are people who are sick from their obesity and metabolic syndrome, and they need help. And they've tried and have been unsuccessful. And here is something that could actually be beneficial. And so We should be trying to help these people because I'm a doctor, I'm an MD, and my job is to help people. These set of medications clearly have beneficial effects in a segment of the population. The scientist hat has a slightly different response. Number one, yes, these medicines cause weight loss. What kind of weight loss? Well, turns out equal amounts of muscle and fat. Now, fat loss is the goal, but muscle loss is not. It causes equal amounts of loss of muscle and fat. Do you know what else causes equal amounts of loss of muscle and fat? Starvation. And in fact, that's how these medicines work. They cause you to not eat. They cause you to starve. So you're losing equal amounts of muscle and fat. Now, is loss of muscle a good thing? No, it's a terrible thing. So number one, sarcopenia has been shown to be a major driver of mortality. Number two, ask any little old lady whether she had a little bit more muscle before she breaks her hip. So losing muscle is not the answer. Losing fat is a better answer, but these drugs do both. And the reason is because they make you not eat. Now, did they make you not eat because of the effect on the brain? Possibly, but more likely, and the data show, the reason is because they are delaying gastric emptying. They are causing your stomach to move slower. And so the food doesn't go through the stomach, through the intestine. It's basically causing a paresis of your intestine. And that's why you're not eating. And of course, this is why you have all the side effects of these medicines, the nausea, the vomiting, the rare but nonetheless very severe concern about pancreatitis, and most importantly and concerning, gastroparesis, stomach turning to stone. The stomach doesn't work at all. And worse yet, when you stop the medicines, the gastroparesis does not get better.
And the trial data suggests, I think, that the weight loss only remains while patients stay on the medication.
That was my next concern in terms of the science and also the public health aspect. So the fact is, gastroparesis is a really bad side effect. Also, from a science standpoint, I'm an endocrinologist, and we believe in hormone deficiencies and therefore hormone replacement therapy. Like if you're growth hormone deficient, you get growth hormone. If you're thyroid hormone deficient, you get thyroid hormone. These are GLP-1 analogs, these medicines. Do any of these obese people have GLP-1 deficiency? No.
Could you just break down for listeners who don't know what GLP-1 agonist is?
Right. So GLP-1 stands for glucagon-like peptide 1. It is a hormone that is made in your intestine that then goes to your pancreas and increases insulin release to bring your blood glucose down. And it also goes to your brain to tell your brain you've eaten. So GLP-1, there's a huge gene in your genome called preproglucagon, and it gets cleaved into different pieces. And one of those pieces is called GLP-1. And so GLP-1 analogs are related to this GLP-1 that is made in your intestine, which you can measure. But the GLP-1 analogs have much longer half-lives. They've been altered in some fashion. So they're analogs. They're not the native hormone because they last long. Anyway, the bottom line is these GLP-1 analogs, they work, but they work because they make you not eat. And as soon as you stop them, the weight comes rushing back. And the reason is because you haven't actually fixed their problem. You've bypassed their problem. You've band-aided their problem because they don't have GLP-1 deficiency. If they had GLP-1 deficiency, you'd be fixing their problem, but you're not. It's something else. So that doesn't, from a scientist standpoint, that doesn't sit very well with me. And then finally, we have the concern about the cost and the public health issue. So if everyone in America who qualified for a GLP-1 analog got it, that would be a cost of $2.1 trillion to the US healthcare system, which is currently at $4.1 trillion. So this would be a 50% surcharge on top of what we're already paying. Okay, and we can't afford what we're paying now. That will break the Medicare and Social Security bank by the end of the decade anyway. And now you want to put a 50% surcharge on top of that?
Hence the huge profits to be made in weight loss drugs.
Right. Absolutely. Now, these GLP-1 analogs will get you, Ozempic and Wegovy will get you a 16% mean weight loss. Tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro or Zepbound, will get you about a 20% mean weight loss. And that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. My clinician says that's good. I'm not knocking them. The question is 16 to 20% mean weight loss. Sounds good. However, if we just cut our added sugar, the USDA recommendation is 12 teaspoons of added sugar per day, but we really need to get down to 6 to 9. We could effectuate a 29% weight loss. And instead of spending 2.1 trillion, we could save 3.0 trillion. So we'd get twice the weight loss and save double the money.
And one of the reasons for the level of sugar in our diet, Rob, is because of the high level of consumption of ultra-processed food.
Right. The point is that the added sugar in our ultra-processed food is the cause of that sugar glut, that overload. So it's our ultra-processed food that's driving this. So if we could get the ultra-processed food to not be dangerous by either removing it or replacing it or boosting it or blocking it, there are multiple different ways to do this. We could save a whole lot of money, do even better in terms of weight loss, not have any side effects, and solve the problem. So from a public health standpoint, that to me makes a whole lot more sense. Now, having said that, there is one good thing that these GLP-1 analogs have done that I will be forever grateful for. Everyone and his brother, up till these GLP-1 analogs, said, oh, you're obese. You have a character flaw. You're a glutton and a sloth. You're weak-willed. You are subhuman. Well, these GLP-1 analogs have actually demonstrated to the majority of the population that, in fact, obesity is biochemically driven. I have been saying biochemistry drives behavior for 30 years, and people have not believed it. Well, now they believe it. And so this is a huge opportunity to educate the public about, number one, biochemistry, and number two, science, and number three, the role science plays in society, which is something that basically has been swept under the rug by big food and, to be honest with you, big politics.
And going back to fast food and ultra-processed food, if sugar is an additive and caffeine is an additive, is there anything else done to this food to make it particularly appealing so people find it hard to turn down?
Well, sugar and caffeine are the two addictive substances that have been added to food. No argument there. But we also know that other things can increase the salience of food. Fat can increase the salience of sugar. Example, which would you rather have, a Cinnabon or a pixie stick?
I'm afraid, as a Brit, I don't know what a pixie stick is.
Oh, it was just granulated sugar in a straw from my childhood.
That doesn't sound very appealing.
Yeah, no, it was horrible. It's disgusting. They put some artificial flavor in. It was horrible, but it was straight sugar. Cotton candy.
Yeah, I know what that is.
Okay, same idea. Pixie sticks, cotton candy. The Cinnabon is way more appealing.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the fat increases the salience of the sugar. On the other hand, if you just did straight fat, that would be called lard. And that's not particularly appealing. So the fat increases the salience of the sugar. There's another thing that increases the salience of the sugar too. It's called salt. So like honey roasted peanuts. Which do you prefer? The straight peanuts or the honey roasted peanuts? And the answer is, well, the studies show that honey roasted peanuts are actually bigger sellers. And the reason is because the salt increases the salience of the sugar. So there are things that the food industry can do to manipulate. The fact is that by increasing the salience of sugar, they've been able to increase sales. But it's the sugar at the basis in each case. And the reason is because sugar is addictive. Now, if sugar were only addictive, I wouldn't care because, after all, caffeine is addictive. Caffeine is a model drug of addiction. And there's a Starbucks on every street corner, and you don't see me railing against Starbucks. The point is that Starbucks hasn't been shown to be toxic yet, unless, of course, you consume it with alcohol. Alcohol and caffeine, that's Four Loko, and that will kill you. and that's been banned. But caffeine in alone, just because something's addictive doesn't make it dangerous. As long as you are basically consuming caffeine at a normal rate, the only thing that's going to happen is sleep deprivation. So it's not the addictive property of sugar that's the problem, and it's not the toxic property of sugar that's the problem. It's the combination of the two together. When something is both addictive and toxic at the same time, that's called cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol. Now we have a problem, and we regulate all four of those. Well, sugar meets those same criteria of toxic and addictive.
And there's one staggering figure that you quote, that there are 600,000 foods in the American food supply, and 74% of them contain sugar, and that 56% of all sugar in the US diet is found in processed foods.
Exactly right. And 67% of the sugar in kids' diets come from ultra-processed foods.
And Rob, between 1982 and 2012, there's really one key change in the food the consumers are buying.
And that is ultra-processed food. So food industry does not want this issue, but all the data keeps coming back to this notion. So the way I like to phrase it is, sugar's the payload, ultra-processed food is the vehicle. Which is worse, the nuclear device or the missile that delivers it?
Right, well, that's probably not a decision any of us want to have to make, but...
That's where we are. And that's the argument that we will be making at the May 17th meeting.
And are you hoping that organisations such as the World Health Organization will begin to take this seriously as a medical diagnosis?
That's the reason for the meeting. We will see what they do. It is definitely a dicey proposition for them.
Well, really interesting. Well, thank you, Rob, so much for talking today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Liz. Thank you for being who you are and for being so prepared for this.
Thanks so much, Rob. Really appreciate it. Great talking to you. Goodbye. Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the show, if you could leave a review, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.